The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, let this time be fruitful and helpful as we want to further understand and encounter your word in the Holy Scriptures. And we pray this in Jesus' name.
Amen.
So, speaking of encountering your word, as you probably have heard, we are going to have another trip to Israel. And that's coming up about exactly a year from now. And so we're going to have a few folks just share a little bit about what they appreciated about the trip we went on last time to just get you thinking about it if you didn't go. And so Kevin McNamara went last time. He and Karen went along in our group. And so Kevin's going to share a little bit about our experience and his experience.
I'll start off with group travel is my least favorite way of going. Okay? When I turned 60, I went to Europe for 60 days backpacking. I booked 9 nights, a Eurail pass, and my opera in Milan. When Karen and I go, like we went for 31 days to Australia and New Zealand, I have to book all of the lodging, the transport, but we do local tours a la carte. In this case, because of where you're going on this kind of a trip, a group tour makes infinite sense. A lot of it that I got out of it was the geography and the timeline of the Bible, especially the first year when we went to Bethlehem, and then the last 3 years when we went up north, close to Syria, when the planes were flying over the border. Never felt threatened. 2 ways they present things over there. One is they surround what is old and explain it, like Caesarea and things like that, and others that they improve so you can understand it. Like the Mount of the Beatitudes, if you took a picnic blanket up there and sat on the hill, you wouldn't get anything out of it. But they built a church up there in the circle of the Beatitudes, and you could see the Sea of Galilee, so you could feel like what it would have felt like, but you've got a better setting to understand it. And a lot of it has to do with getting the appreciation, like I say, for the geography, because up there's a lot of greenery. It's not desert like you see on TV all the time. And the further south you go, you get to the desert and a lot more of the Old Testament. Food-wise, I could live on their diet all the time. It's very Mediterranean, which means fresh, local, and in season. So if you're in eggplant season and don't like eggplant, you're in trouble. And I, for the first time, understood what kosher meant when they explained it. And that's that you can't get milk at night with your coffee, because milk products take the morning to digest when you're working. And then you don't want to be eating at 6 or 7 in the evening and still digesting at 10 at night. So they figure the meat products in the evening digest a lot faster and you still get a good night's sleep. So things about cultural things like that that also have a basis in somewhat in science. But, you know, and the other thing I like about a canned tour like this was a couple of things. We only had 2 major shopping stops. When you go a la carte, every tour you buy has about an hour or 2 at some roadside shopping place. That does not happen here. Yeah. The other thing that I really enjoyed was my Uncle Arthur had passed away just recently, and I got to put a memorial to him in the Western Wall and then text it back to my cousins, his daughters, both my godfather and my uncle. So, yeah, and the old history in Jerusalem is encapsulated by itself, and it really is a big undertaking and very solid, long days of good stuff. So,
Right, yeah, great. Good job. I think these trips, and certainly our trip, was made a huge impact in people's lives, and we're going to keep hearing from some folks in the weeks ahead. And then coming up on the 29th, I believe it is, correct, Julie? Russ Goodman, who's the head of Faith-Based Expeditions, the company we work through, will be here just to answer questions during this time, but then we'll give a full-on presentation after the late service. The number one thing people ask is about security, safety, is it safe, these types of things, and he'll address all of that. Certainly our experience is that, I even say this today, even with the increased tensions that are kind of ebbing and flowing always, I felt safer there than I did going through Europe for sure. And even in the United States, I felt safer. So anyway, but that's more to come on that. I hope you'll think about it if you've been ever wondering if you could make it to Israel. It is a powerful experience. So with that, that's your little tidbit there. So we're going to move back into our cultural world of the New Testament. And remember, we're trying to bridge between their world and our world. So our hermeneutical question, let's read it together again. I'm trying to get you to memorize this question. How can the Christian faith, first experienced and symbolically articulated in an ancient culture now long out of date, speak meaningfully to life as we experience it today? That's the question. I'm giving you a bunch of tools. I have been really lifted up by the number of people who have come to me and said, hey, you know, I'm really appreciating your class. I was reading the Bible the other day. And then when I heard that story in the New Testament, I thought of honor and shame, or I thought of kinship, or I thought of patronage. These concepts that I've been teaching you. So that's music to my ears. So I'm really thankful for that. Remember, I'm simply a curator here, bringing you some information from a lot of resources. So we had this great acronym on honor and shame and patronage, the GET acronym, gift and gratitude paradox, exchange of benefits, titles. So I'm not going to go through all of those. Where we finished up before is we finished up with kinship, this whole sense of family, how important family and the clan is to the expectations that people have of you as an individual. Genealogies, how important they are when it comes to honor. Today, our families, we do genealogies, but not for the reason they did them back then. They did them back then to say who you are and how much honor and how other people look at you and what can you do in your life. All of that had to do with your genealogy. Within your kin, there's a mandate to forgive. So when Jesus, I don't think I made this point that strongly before, when Jesus gives his Lord's Prayer, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. In your kin, within the church, I'm not saying this doesn't apply outside the church, but in particular within this new kinship of the church, there's a mandate that you are to forgive. So then the powerful concept of oikos in Greek households, which included more than just your brother or sister or mom or dad, it included your whole household. And then with that, the power of adoption. That for people in the first century, to be adopted, to be given a new family, was unbelievably powerful. It's certainly powerful for us today, for maybe a child who doesn't have parents, they're adopted, or their parent can't take care of them properly, and then so they grow up in an adopted family, and that's a beautiful, wonderful thing. However, in the first century, what it meant is that you had a kin, and you had a family, and now you had honor that you didn't have before, and now you have some. It's not quite like that. For us, it's like, are you taken care of? Do you get to go to school? Do you have a roof over your head? Do you get proper nourishment, proper care as a child? All of that's true in the first century too. But when Paul talks about the concept of adoption, it's like, wow, I have honor that I never had before. And so when we talk about being children of God, so we now are adopted by God in Christ Jesus, we have God is our parent, and you can't have any more honor than that. So I think thinking about that from the concept of the first century is also really important. Then we worked with marriage and endogamy. That is that, you marry your closer kin, not direct kin, but and how marriage was not simply, in fact, it wasn't at all for the gratification or the blessing of the individual. It was about the community, it was about having kids, and it was about establishing relationships with other families. That's what marriage is about. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't affection and care and fulfillment in the marriage experience. And Paul actually, read now, once you hear this, read some of what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6 about marriage. We hear what he has to say because it talks about wives being subject to your husbands and husbands, but it says, husbands, treat your wives like Christ treats the church. We have no idea how radical that is today. In fact, to us, it just kind of almost sounds archaic. But in that day, women were property. Marriage was just simply a contract to establish, one, to have a place to raise children. That was the primary thing. But to say that there should be mutual affection and respect in marriage is unbelievable in the first century. So, again, I'm helping you understand how important kindred was in the first century. So when you read the New Testament, when you read the Old Testament, you can go, oh, wow, I get it, in a way that you probably wouldn't if you just compare yourself to our current culture. So now we're going to move to the concept of purity and pollution in the first century. This is going to be something we're going to talk about for about the next 2-3 weeks, because there's a lot here. And it's also a challenging subject. And I would say probably it's the thing that's the hardest for Westerners of the 21st century to connect with people of the first century. But I'm going to try and help you with that in this class. So what you're seeing here is a picture of the southern steps near the western wall that Kevin mentioned in his little introduction. These are the actual steps that Jesus would have walked up entering the temple in Jesus' day, and we got to stand there. But right there next to where you walk up is what's called mikvah. I can't remember if that's plural or singular. But is that, somebody know? Anyway. So at any rate, these are ritual baths that people would take because they were unclean, and in order to go into a holy place, you might not even be unclean, you just might be just kind of normal, but you're going into a holy place, and so they would do these ritual baths, and we find these all over the place in the Holy Land. Certainly, this one is right by the southern steps, so that when you went up, before you went up into the temple, you would take a bath, a ritual bath to kind of purify yourself. I show this just to help you start getting your head around how important this concept of clean versus unclean was in the first century. Now we find these in little towns, near synagogues. These mikvah were in the Dead Sea of Qumran, the Qumran community. There we find many of these ritual baths that were in existence in the first century. So, like I say, I think this is a very, yes, sorry.
Yeah, one of the modern versions of that, if you go around New York City now, they've got tour buses that park all over the city to do your daily mikvah.
Is that right?
And you go in and you purify yourself by prayer.
So you purify yourself by prayer versus a bath. Interesting.
But
good.
They're parked all over New York.
But they're parked all over New York. Okay, that's good. See, that's a part of my culture that I don't experience from being more on the West Coast, probably. So let's just start getting our head around this concept. When you think about something clean or something that's unclean, when something's unclean, it's somewhere it shouldn't be. So for instance, when I'm outside and there's a big pile of dirt, no big deal. It's fine. But if I'm sitting in my living room and there's a big pile of dirt sitting there in the living room on the carpet, I have a problem. That's clean versus unclean. Something is where it shouldn't be. And we have these standards, don't we? Some of them. Some of us do. Okay, no. I'm going to go there. We all have different ones. How many of you take off your shoes before you go in the house? How many of you don't? Okay, so we've got a little more than half that don't and a little more than half that do. Enough that when I go into people's houses, I ask typically. And then when they come to my house, they ask, and I say no, but we do have a mat. That's a ritual cleanliness. Who would think just to walk in somebody's house and just, there's a mat right there, wipe off your feet. I remember my mom telling me that. But now sometimes we take off our shoes. That probably makes, a bit more, it's probably more effective. I don't know. So let's hear a little bit from some of these authors. This is Molina and Rohrbar. One traditional way of talking about such an overall system of meaning is in terms of a purity system. A system of pure, in place, and impure, out of place. Or a system of clean, in place, and unclean, out of place. Pure and impure, clean and unclean can be predicated of persons, groups, things, times, and places. Let me just pause here and tell you that one of the things that archaeologists find, especially from this era, is lots of pottery that's been purposefully broken. They can tell us if it's just like, if it got cracked or got squished or whatever, but it's purposefully broken or destroyed, or it's thrown in the garbage dump, along with animal bones and this type of thing. That's one way we know if a town is Jewish or not Jewish, because why? Do you find, what kind of bones would you not find in a Jewish town? Pork. Pig bone. That's why we know part of the Sea of Galilee was primarily Jewish. If you go from Capernaum and then over onto the eastern side, that's all Jewish. They don't find any pig bones. You go across the other side of the lake, that's where the Gentile settlements were. You find tons of pig bones. You remember when Jesus sailed across the water? He said, let's get in the boat, go across the sea. It's a big lake. What did the disciples think? Oh, good idea, Jesus. They said, why are you going over there? That's where the Gentiles are. That's where the demons are. That's the bad place. So in our trip to Israel, we'll get on that boat and we'll read that story and we'll talk about that so you can see that. But, and of course they get over there, what does Jesus find? An evil spirit. And they're going like, see Jesus, we told you. And the storm hits, you got to silence the storm. There's all kinds of things with this. But one of the things, we find these pottery that are deliberately broken. Why do you think?
It's unclean.
If things can become unclean, here's the thing, pottery, there's no ritual you can do to pottery to make it clean again. It's garbage. Throw it away. It's like a paper cup for us. Stone vessels you can wash and ritually make pure again. If it somehow touched something that made it unclean, it could be salvaged. Not pottery. So, pottery, they would just deliberately destroy if that vessel became unclean. So, I imagine from a financial standpoint, it'd be a big deal to not mess up your pottery. Because it's no good after that. Such purity distinctions embody the core values of a society and thereby provide clarity of meaning, direction of activity, and consistency for social behavior. What accords with these values and their structural expression in a purity system is considered pure, and what does not is viewed as polluted. So, really, purity systems, all cultures have them. We're just less cognizant of them. than others. I think the term as a map is kind of helpful. It helps you kind of map out how you live and how you go about your day. Let's hear some more from Melina. Purity systems thus divide maps, designated social definitions, or bounded categories in which everything and everybody either fits and is considered clean or does not and is regarded as defiled. As such, these socially contrived maps provide boundaries that fit over individuals, over groups, over the environment, over time, and over a space. Spaces can be clean, unclean. These boundaries are known to everyone and enculturated in the society so that one knows when one's behavior is out of bounds. Cleaning or purification refers to the process of returning matter or persons to its proper place. Okay, and these are sociologists and theologians, so, it's heady stuff. But basically, think about the concept of a map, and now start thinking of boundaries and things being in their place and being out of place. So, a special time is the Sabbath. You do certain things on the Sabbath, and you don't do certain things on the Sabbath. That's a sense of what's clean and what's unclean. Go back to the blue laws. When our culture was more dictated perhaps by the church or Christian values or whatever, and Protestants' Sabbath has been Sunday. So it was worked into the actual laws of our society that certain things don't happen on the Sabbath. Why? Because they're unclean. Now, we don't use that term like they did in the first century. But, hey, you don't go shopping on Sunday. That was the view, right? It would be to defy the Sabbath to go and do your grocery shopping on Sunday. That's the way it used to be. I'm not saying that's true today, or should be true today. I'm just saying, trying to help us think about this. I know stories of Montana farmers or Midwestern farmers who their wheat was ready, and here comes the hailstorm, and it's Sunday, and they still didn't go out to work. Because that's simply wrong. And it doesn't matter what the consequences are. To me, I'm like, get out there, man, and harvest! So I want that, for a Jewish person of the first century, to do work at all would be to make the day unholy. We oftentimes think they were just rigid, legalists, but you have to understand why they were so legalistic. And to this day, we've got elevators that you get in that you don't have to press what floor you go to, because that's work. I don't know if you know that. Kevin knows that in New York and in bigger cities, certainly in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem hotels, on the Sabbath, they have Sabbath elevators. You get in, and it just goes to each floor. It takes a long time to get up to the 11th floor. So you want to know which ones. Sometimes, usually they have one, there's a little light that's not lit or something that tells you that's not a Sabbath elevator. So the rest of it, you can get on and go up and press the floor you want to go to. But again, for them to do that, to press that button, now not all Jews, this would be the more Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Jews, that would make that time unholy. So, and what do you do in that time? What holy things you do? You worship, you say the Shema, you read Scripture, you pray, you dwell with family. That's something that I think we've lost, haven't we? In my last congregation, was North and South Dakota Germans who went to Lodi and make a new little North and South Dakota, And what they did on Sunday is they went to church and then they went to family. but they did. That was it. And in a certain sense, although our families are so different now and everything, but that was cool. You know? So, anyways, I'm trying to help you get the concept here. Places, temple activity is obviously a holy place. So let's make a connection to our situation here a little bit. I grew up in my Missouri Synod Lutheran congregation. There was an altar rail that went all the way around the altar, and it was marble once you got up there. And I remember the pastor being very clear, you know, you don't mess around up here. Like sometimes a kid gets loose and starts to, and it's still that way today. We typically don't let our kids run around like a playground in the chancel area. And yet, we don't want to scar that kid, you know, so we want to be more gracious with those boundaries than we've been in the past. But, you know, still we have sacred spaces. There are things that, like, for instance, how many of you think that it should be okay to have a latte in the church? Come on, raise your hands. All right. How many of you think that would be a bad thing? That would be, you Pharisees.
I don't want to spill coffee on the
You don't want
carpet.
it on the, you're practical. You're practical. I'm not saying one is good or the other. In non-denominational churches, we have I've gone to these churches, these kind of big box, you know, churches, and they know you're not a visitor if you don't have a latte. No, they know you're a visitor if you don't have a latte or a coffee or whatever. I mean, so now if I don't want to look like a visitor in one of those churches, I make sure and get to the coffee bar before I go in, because then I'm one of them. You know? What about dress? Oh boy. I'm not going to spend the rest of our time on dress, but I'm just trying to help you see we have unclean, clean thoughts. Thoughts. That doesn't sound right. We all have unclean and clean thoughts. We have views. Sorry, I'm not going to get personal here. We have views of clean and unclean, just like they did in the first century. We're just not as cognizant of them, and we don't use that language. When I grew up, my mom would say to me, you know, we put on ties and we put on our dress shoes because that's the way you honor God. To go in informal clothes would be a defilement. Right? Now, the problem, of course, is we've got a whole other generation that doesn't look at clothes and shoes like that at all. And so, having to dress up to church is a barrier that keeps them away. And now we're in the Northwest, and you know, there's all kinds of things that come into this. And again, I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm for a church that if you want to wear jeans, that's fine. If you want to wear a tie and a suit, that's beautiful too. You know, but that's my point is simply to get us thinking about places, holy places, synagogues, temple was big time. We won't have time to go through all the regulations about purity in the temple. But persons could be, this is a little different for us, clean or unclean. You know, and so it had to do with who you could marry, who you could touch, who you could eat dinner with. Is this an unclean person? Why are people upset at Jesus that he eats with tax collectors and sinners? Now for us, we hear, oh, well, he's not a hypocrite. He doesn't think he's holier than thou. Jewish people, if I had dinner with someone who was unclean, they would make me unclean. It would be a kind of, it's more than just that it's breaking the law. We'll get back to that one. Foods, things, I talked about, utensils, all of these things. Offerings, how do you make an offering? You know, all of these things kind of come into play. So this uncleanness when you contact something, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, this is the big difference for us. When you contact something that's unclean, it transfers its uncleanness to you. This is something that we don't think that way, or do we? We'll get to this. All right. So now this is when it comes to persons, women, men, roles. All of this starts to come into play. Philo of Alexandria is writing at the time of Jesus, in essence. He's a Jewish philosopher in Alexandria in northern Africa. The dispersion of Jewish thought. So he's a very important person to read, to understand what's going on. And so this is what he has to say. So gals, hang in there. Sorry. Marketplaces and council chambers and courts of justice and large companies and assemblies of numerous crowds and a life in the open air full of arguments and actions relating to war and peace are suited to men. Those places are places that men are accepted to be. But taking care of the house and remaining at home are the proper duties of women. The virgins have their apartments in the center of the house within the innermost doors, and the full-grown women not going beyond the vestibule and outer courts. For there are two kinds of states, the greater and the smaller. Notice he doesn't say the lesser, it's different words, smaller and greater. And the larger ones are called really cities, but the smaller ones are called houses. And the superintendence and management of these is allotted to the two sexes separately. Men having the government of the greater, which government is called a polity, and women that of the smaller, whoops, I didn't mean to, which is called oikon. Therefore, let no woman busy herself about those things which are beyond the providence of oikon. All right, why am I'm not just putting this up here to show that we've changed in gender roles, but I am saying that spaces were the proper place for certain genders and not the place for other genders, for women, for instance, versus men. And men would not want to be, it would be an intrusion into the other space if men started to try and run the household, so to speak. That was a woman's place to do that. When you think about what would defile something, for a woman, I know this is hard to hear or even think about, but for a woman to come into a place that was not meant for her would defile that place. And it kind of went both ways. For instance, in the Temple of Jerusalem, and I've taught on this many times, but just to remind you, and I should have put a little diagram up here, but if you think about the Temple Mount and structure as a big rectangle, the first area inside that big rectangle was the court of the Gentiles. It was called that because if you were a Jewish person if you were a Gentile who had become a Jew, and you could do that, you could be in that section. I mean, you had to be Jewish to be in there, but you're not Jewish by genealogy. You're a Gentile, and I've become a Jew. I believe in the God of Israel. And there were many people that way. In the book of Acts, actually, there are people called God-fearers. Check it out. Do a concordance and look up God-fearers in the book of Acts. We don't know who these people were. I think, and many scholars think, that these are Gentiles who were Jewish. Makes perfect sense because they know all the stories. They're there. They hear the message of Christ. They're right. Anyway, there's that spot. The next area was the place that women, Jewish women, could be, and men. The next place before that was the place that only men could be. If a woman went in there, she would defile that place. If a Gentile went into the Jewish spot, they would defile that place. Finally, there was the place, the inner sanctuary, where only the priests could go. And they would, of course, be very attentive to their cleanliness. Not as in washing their hands to make sure they don't have any germs, but making sure they have not touched anything that would make them unclean, because if they go in there, then they mess up the whole space. And then, yes?
Did each section have its own door?
Each section, there was a wall around it, and yes, each section had its door. And in fact, even though the death penalty was taken away from the Jewish people around the time of Jesus, that's why Pontius Pilate has to get involved. Going back historically, we have actually found a little, what would you call that above the door? A sign that said, if you are a Gentile and enter here, you will be executed. So there was a warning right about, you cannot go in.
Enter at your own risk.
Enter at your own risk, exactly. So, yes, there were doors that you could enter into each section.
Yeah, because if the Jew went through the Gentile place to get to their place, they'd be unclean, wouldn't they?
No, because all those Gentiles would have followed the right things. Yes. So, no, they would have to go through the court of the Gentiles to get to their section. Yeah. So, anyway, I wanted you to hear a little bit about that just again. So now, let's think about theirs and ours. And boy, I'm looking at my time. I want to get to some texts here today. So, De Silva, another author that I've been reading, actually says some really helpful things here. Let's hear what he has to say, and then we'll get to some texts. We will feel that the Jewish and Greco-Roman worlds, with their aversions toward defilement and regulations for purity, are less completely foreign if we come to understand that while we would never use the words ourselves, we still interact with our world in ways deeply reminiscent of purity codes and fear of pollution. As we look into our own lives and ask what sorts of lines we hold dear, and I've just played with some of those, or consider what boundaries we are heavily invested in keeping solid, or ponder what sorts of things or persons we respond to as being out of place, we discover that we carry about within us a purity code that is a security code that is every bit as complex as that articulated in Leviticus. The interesting thing, after when I read this, I thought, actually, at least in Leviticus, it's all written down. Not that you could, I mean, ours, I think, is more subtle, or less more under the surface. The underlying rationales we project onto our codes are completely different, of course, from the ones we encounter in the first century, but the dynamics are strikingly similar and merit some consideration as a point of entry into that cultural context. So, let's just think about a few things. I've already talked about dirt, shoes. What about even your spitting? I mean, I was a baseball player. I spit, but I spit on the grass. If I just here, wouldn't some of you get up and walk out? Like, he's lost his mind. What's a big rule the kids have to learn at school? You don't spit in the sidewalk. That's horrible. But that's a purity code. So our concerns about defilement, though, for us, and this is very, are more microbial and medical now. We don't do the common cup here. I won't go into that subject. But it has everything to do with people being freaked out about church. It's the proper way to have communion. Okay? It's just a fact. So, but I understand. So we, it's an adiaphora. We can dip because people feel more comfortable with that. Our purity issues are more about that. But then in the first century. The first century, they didn't even know about germs. It was ritual. It was an actual belief that something was clean or unclean that dictated their concerns. And lo and behold, some of those regulations actually were very good for hygiene. But that's, again, another subject. So we have purity restoration actions just like they did, but they had lots of ways that something which was unclean gets to be made clean again. So what do we do with, this is where I'm comfortable talking about some of these subjects, but so we have discharges as human beings. And those, for us, there's proper cleanliness around that. But we consider those discharges clean or unclean, and there are certain parameters and regulations around all of that. But in the first century, it wasn't just the discharge that was unclean, like spit. Like, don't spit, you got germs in your mouth, that's not clean. For them, it's the person is actually unclean. So a woman who has a hemorrhage, it isn't just her bleeding that is unclean, it's her. She is unclean because she has this hemorrhage. So you have to get that difference between them and us. I want to keep going here. First century, what about people? What's a big division in the first century? Come on. Races, you're right. But what were the two races? Jews and Gentiles.
Jews and everybody else.
Okay. Except now let's throw in, what's that other group? They're up north. And there's a parable. It's called the Good Samaritans. They're a different kind of Jewish group. Even worse, because they perverted the faith, according to Jews. So there were Jews and Samaritans, and then there were Gentiles and Jews, and these were people that you didn't rub shoulders with. You certainly wouldn't marry someone of a different race. So this was the biblical world. Now, is our world different than that? Fortunately, thankfully, we're starting to remove ourselves from the hundreds of years of thinking that because someone's skin color is different, that somehow they're of a different, I don't touch them, I don't hang out with them. But it wasn't that long ago, right? Maybe I'm wrong. But, I guess I have the luxury of not growing up in the South or not growing up, 70 years ago. But a person of color, a black person, sitting next to someone, that would defile a white person. This is the way we thought. And now we look back with embarrassment, hopefully, and great repentance about that. But it's not just here that happens. It happens all over the world with people of the same skin color, but they're of a different tribe. When I was in Ethiopia, Oromo versus the Amharic, And then there's other little groups. There's actually I forget how many, 30-some different tribal groups. And they know, I look at that person, I go, oh, well, that person's Oromo or that Amharic. I wouldn't know, but they know. Swedes and the Norwegians. I don't know the difference. Sorry. But they know. Oh, okay. So we have had laws about who could interact with who around race. That was certainly the biblical world. Certainly the biblical world. And yes, Bill.
I grew up in Maryland, Western Maryland.
Yeah.
While I was in school, the schools in Maryland were segregated.
Yes, segregated schools in Maryland. Yeah.
Where I live, other things weren't segregated.
Other things weren't segregated.
So we had, teams and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So when I was in high school, that went away.
Yes.
Of course, Southern Maryland was very southern, but
Yeah.
other parts of Maryland weren't. And for us, when they integrated the schools, it's about time.
It's about time when they integrate the schools because you had that. Yeah.
It's interesting being in that location and that transpired for us.
Right.
It was different.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. That whole dynamic of the desegregation and all of that a lot of you have lived that in a way that I just look back and go, wow, You know, anyway. So there's people of different races. What about homeless people? You know, we internally have, and I'm not saying this judgmentally, but because there might be hygiene issues, there might be other issues, but what do you sense when you go through Seattle and people are living on the sidewalk and you walk by their house? It feels weird to me. It feels unclean. It feels like it's out of place. Now, I understand why they're there, and I'm not judging them for being there. That's a whole other thing, but it seems out of place. And then, you know, again, yeah, I just want to get you thinking about this. So this is what De Silva says, and then we'll look at some text here the last 10 minutes. This will help cross the cultural chasm between us and the writers of the New Testament, to say nothing of the compilers of the Torah, as well as allow us to see what lines Jesus might challenge us to cross in order to fulfill the royal law of love. I ceased to despise the Pharisees' lack of compassion long ago, or rather I came to see how much I had in common with them. When I was confronted with my own purity codes and the separateness from other classes of people, I was conditioned from birth to observe. That's a powerful thing to think about. All right, so Leviticus. You are to distinguish between holy and common, between unclean and clean, and you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them through Moses. This is a big part of Judaism. Now, in the weeks to come, we're going to talk about Judaism. We're going to talk about the Greco-Roman world, but I wanted to get us into a text here. So we've got this common versus holy, unclean versus clean. Let's see. Yes, that's fine. All right. Let's just keep going here because I want to get to the text. Let's look, having heard what I had to say, let's look at a couple Bible passages. Let me get over here to my Bible program. Let's look at, well, let's actually do Luke, because this one we might not have time for. All right, this is a great story in Luke where a woman comes up to Jesus, presses in on him, and I want to read this to you now with what you've heard about purity and pollution and clean and unclean. See if it hits you a little differently than before. And in fact, we won't have time for small groups, so can I have some mic runners? Because in just a minute, I'm going to have you talk. Anybody else? Anybody over here? Who's got? Okay, Tom, you're up. Okay, so let me read this, and then I'm going to want to hear some insight from you all. As Jesus went, the crowds pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. And though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his clothes. And immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and press in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out from me." When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him, and how she had been immediately healed. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." What jumps out at you from what you, as far as what's the situation of this woman? Tom, come up, Billie Jean appear, and then who else? Who else got a hand? Okay, then Ken, right here, yes.
Well, the fringe of his garment is going to be at the bottom, right?
Yes.
So she had to be like crawling to him,
Yes.
not walking up to him, not like
Okay.
everyone else who was there
Good.
pressing in on him. She crawled up to him and barely touched his garment, believing that he
Yes.
would heal her.
Excellent. Why do you think she did that?
Because she knew she was unclean. She knew she could be stoned, probably, because
Yes.
she wasn't supposed to be there.
Yes. Sue?
An animal.
What's
She was reduced to an animal.
almost reduced to an animal? Yeah. Okay. Could a woman just touch a man
No.
and then throw on? Yeah, Sandy and then Kevin. Yeah. Because I think Sandy's right on. Yeah. Go ahead. Yep.
She had low hemoglobin. She could hardly crawl,
Oh,
but she had great faith.
yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you for that from a nurse. Ken.
Purity trumped impurity.
Purity trumped impurity. In this story, how so? Say some more.
Jesus talked about he didn't see her, but he felt his power being released.
Yes.
Didn't know who it was.
Yes, good.
Then she identified herself.
Right.
All could see what was going on.
So what Ken's saying, now what did I say about how impurity works? If something that's unclean touches something that's clean, what happens? The clean thing becomes, is that what happened here? Different direction. Interesting. Yes, back and then over here. Yep.
I think that because it takes a while for it to explain, make it die, but I think the other side of this is that the crowd knows this impurity law, and Jesus is I don't want to say embarrassing her, but he's raising this issue.
Yep. Keep going. Don't worry about it. Yeah, keep going.
He's raising the issue publicly, not to embarrass her, but to put it out on the, I guess, to make it visible.
Okay.
Because she could have walked by, not known she's healed. It's not about raising the attention of the healing. It's raising the attention also of the impurity that they're all aware of.
Okay, so Jesus does not like, hey, I'll talk to you later.
Yeah.
He just celebrates it. Wait, no, someone touched me. He knew who it was. He holds this up for everybody to see. It's a great point to think about when it comes to what's clean, what's not clean, defilement, all of this. He says, we're going to learn something from this story, in addition to celebrating this woman's faith. Excellent, Kim.
Well, him and his feet would have been unclean too. That, they were walking through extreme filth.
Yes.
But her faith was so great that she was willing to touch that.
Yes. Just the hem of his garment. It's kind of like she's worried. There's lots of reasons why she might have done it. Low hemoglobin, she was growing long, whatever. She didn't want other people to see her. Or maybe she was so concerned that she would make Jesus unclean. She was so torn that I'm just going to touch the hem of his garment. Wow. Interesting. Okay, good. What other things jump out at you? Joyce, Tom? Yep.
I just didn't think she had anything to lose.
She didn't have anything to lose. She was
Yeah.
desperate, sure.
And so.
Oh, that's a great.
She was going to die anyway.
Yeah.
And so for her, she had heard about this Jesus who might be able to heal her.
Yes.
With miracles. So therefore, she didn't have a thing to lose.
She didn't have a thing to lose. Let's think about that. Don, go ahead. You speak in the mic, and if it picks up, it's picked up.
Well, and also, it's, as he said, it's not the touching of me, but the faith that you had that would work is what made it work.
Okay. So her faith was a powerful component in this. That's a good thing for us to think about. I saw one over here. Audrey, Tom, raise your hand high, Audrey.
I was going to just say the thing about this whole story
Here,
that
can you use it? Yeah.
so many times was the fact that he said, "Who touched me?" He was aware. She was behind him. All other people. I was just always amazed that he was aware that he was touched.
Yeah, yeah. His awareness that he was touched is a big thing. Yeah, George.
It seems to me that Jesus did not know he was touched, but God did. Okay? Which God was dwelling within Jesus, so he felt the touch. God knew he would feel.
Yeah. That works. We can't separate the two natures, so we don't do that. But yeah. So all right. Couple other things. testifies that she had been healed to lots of people who would be like, you have really messed up. That is a powerful thing, that she is transformed into testifying to a community that she could not be in relationship with. This is the other. So if this woman is unclean because of a hemorrhage, she's severely restricted in who she can hang out with and touch, be with. So did she have a community? She didn't have a community. Now, did you notice it said that she had spent all of their money on physicians? Do you think the average peasant had money for physicians? I can tell you no. This person was from a position of significant means, but yet could not still enter community because she was unclean, because of the discharge, because of her hemorrhage, or hemorrhages, it said. So, so when Jesus touches her and says, your faith has made you well, there's a whole new, and we'll get into this more, but what typically in the first century, if a woman was on her menstruation, if she was on her cycle, then there would be a certain amount of time that would have to go by, and she would do certain things to where she was now in a place of where she wasn't unclean anymore. So you would do this with a priest if they you know, they had certain preparations they had to do to get themselves holy and clean so they could enter the sanctuary. There were purification rituals and things that people would do to become clean again. In this case, does she do anything to become clean again? Only reach to touch his garment and believe, and Jesus makes her well. The word there is salvo, which doesn't just mean salvation, it means healed, whole. In the New Testament, sometimes it's your faith has saved. You can translate this as your faith has saved you, your faith has made you well, your faith, you know, this type of thing. So notice a couple powerful things that we wouldn't even have seen had we not been thinking with this or looking at it with this lens. Yes, come on up, Tom, up here to share it, and then one to Kevin, and we'll close up shop. And I'm still working on getting these mics to work. Sometimes they work, it's a frequency thing.
Well, Jesus was the mikvah, and he was also the priest.
Jesus was the mikvah, he was the purification, and he's also the priest. Yes, beautiful. Yeah. Kevin and then Linda. Yeah.
Tom Hawks reminded me, just this last week, the mayor of Tokyo was in the Kokugikan sumo tournament on the doyo, the wrestling ring.
Yeah.
And he had a heart attack, and two women came up onto the ring and made it unpure.
Oh.
And it took the head of the Sumo Association to absolve them. And
there you go.
I'm sure they're going to tear the doyo down and re-put the sake bottle and salt it up and everything.
That's a great story, though, to see how we as human beings have these to this day. Yeah, Linda.
Don't we still do that by always having confession to clean ourselves before we receive communion?
Yes, confession and absolution is one reason we have it before we have communion. And then sometimes the offertory hymn, which currently, this is one thing I really like about our current liturgy, what do we sing? Create in me a clean heart, oh God. Why? Because we're coming to a holy place. And so we, in faith, simply cry out for God's to make us clean. And so we don't have to go through a bath. We don't have to, you know, we simply, a repentant heart is what opens the door or whatever. Yeah. So you're right. That's great. That's great. All right, so we didn't even get to the woman at the well. which we'll do, because we're gonna. What I want to do in weeks to come now is look a little bit more specifically about the Jewish regulations about purity code. Why did Jesus get himself in such trouble? And then look at how do we live with those as a Christian community now? How do we apply how Jesus interacted with those purity laws, purity and pollution issues? How do we kind of live that out today? That's where we want to go. Great job. Thank you. Hope it's helpful. Go in peace, serve the Lord.